The candles in the Ashworth dining room had been burning for 3 hours when James Wentworth, Duke of Ashworth, pushed back his chair and stood. He did not look at his mother. He did not look at Miss Portia Vane, who sat at his mother's right hand in a gown the color of heavy cream, her pearl earrings catching every point of light in the room. He looked across the long table, past the silver épergne holding its arrangement of hothouse flowers, past the bewildered faces of his dinner guests, toward the far end of the room where Georgiana Hartley sat as still as a woman who has already accepted the worst and found she can survive it. Lady Dorothea's words were still in the air. The gathered company had not yet decided what to do with them. A schemer, her ladyship had said, her voice carrying the particular music of a woman who had never once been corrected in public, a provincial who had attached herself to this household by means I would not trouble you to name. The words had fallen on Georgiana like something dropped from a great height, and she had not moved. She had kept her hands flat on the table, her chin level, her expression that of a woman reading a difficult passage in a foreign language and determining, quietly, not to be defeated by it. James crossed the room. 3 strides. 4. Past the footman standing rigid at the sideboard, past the chair of old Sir William Hardcastle, who had not moved since the dowager spoke. He reached the far end of the table and stopped beside Georgiana's chair and held out his hand. What had brought him here was not the season, not the negotiations, not any of the careful arrangements his mother had assembled across the past 6 weeks. What had brought him here was a letter, delivered that morning by a Hartley footman, written in a hand so honest it had taken him half an hour to trust it. He had not known, until he read it, that he had been waiting for exactly that. The story that ended with James Wentworth crossing that dining room had begun, as most stories in the season of 1814 began, with money that was not there. Simon Hartley had died in March, 3 weeks before the spring planting, and 4 months before his elder daughter was to have her first season. He had died owing £4,200 to a solicitor named Fitch, to a wine merchant in Holborn, and to the man who managed the Hartley barley fields in Hertfordshire. He had died without a son, which meant the Hartley estate would pass, under the terms of the entail his own grandfather had written, to a cousin named Oswald Hartley, whom neither of his daughters had met more than twice. Oswald was not a cruel man. He was simply a man whose plans had already been made, and the Hartley daughters were not part of them. Cecily had wept for 2 days, which was appropriate and genuine and necessary, and then she had dried her face and said they must go to London. She was 23 years old. She had her mother's coloring and her father's warmth, and a particular grace in a room that Georgiana had spent 21 years admiring from just slightly behind it. Cecily understood ballrooms the way some people understand languages, without having to think. She moved through the season's machinery without friction, and the machinery was glad to have her. Georgiana packed her own trunk, her father's books, and a worry that was too specific to name aloud, that they were going to London to be solved, and that the solution was a kind of disappearance. Their Aunt Marjorie installed them in a hired townhouse on Clifford Street, narrow-fronted and smelling of old wallpaper, with a housemaid named Agnes who had a cough that had persisted since February. Aunt Marjorie herself occupied the largest bedroom and managed the household accounts with an eye toward economy that expressed itself mainly as a constant low commentary on the cost of everything. The first dismissive voicing came at Lady Hardcastle's Thursday reception, 11 days into the season. Georgiana was standing near the window with a glass of lemonade she had not yet drunk when she heard Mrs. Pelham say to Mrs. Pelham's companion, in a voice calibrated to carry precisely as far as it did, that the younger Hartley was a sweet enough creature, but one could not quite see the point of her. Cecily had the looks and the manner, Mrs. Pelham said. The other one was simply there. Georgiana took a sip of lemonade. She looked out the window at the street. A cart horse was standing very still in the rain, and she thought that she understood something about that horse that she could not have explained to Mrs. Pelham. She had expected this. She had not expected it to arrive so quickly, or to be so thorough. But the shape of it was familiar. At every assembly in Hertfordshire, at every dinner her father had given, she had occupied the space just to the left of her sister's warmth and learned to find it comfortable. Cecily did not do this to her deliberately. It was simply that Cecily was Cecily, and Georgiana was Georgiana, and the world had strong views about which of those was worth attending to. The Duke of Ashworth called at Clifford Street on the 22nd of April. Georgiana was in the back sitting room mending a hem when Agnes came to tell her. She heard the name and felt nothing she could categorize, which was perhaps its own category. The Duke of Ashworth was 34 years old. He had inherited the title at 19, had managed his estates with a discipline that people who relied on those estates described as cold, and people who envied them described as ruthless. He had a seat in Hertfordshire and a house in Mayfair and a daughter named Clara, who was 6 years old and lived at Ashworth with a governess, and about whom he was said to speak very rarely, and to think, judging by the evidence, almost constantly. He had been a widower for 5 years. Georgiana left the hem on her chair and went upstairs to sit in the corner of the drawing-room that was farthest from the settee where Cecily received him. She brought her mending. She did not intend to be noticed. He was not what the season said he was. The season said cold, said remote, said a man who had entered and exited a marriage contract with the same efficiency he brought to the management of a tenancy roll. What Georgiana saw from her corner was a man who held himself at a tension that cost him something. His jaw was the color of winter stone. His eyes, when they moved across the room's contents, paused at each object for exactly 1 moment longer than was strictly social. When Aunt Marjorie spoke of the Hartley finances with the indirection that was supposed to be delicate, and was not, something moved across his face that was not impatience. It was recognition, Georgiana thought. The look of a man who had done this accounting himself in a different year, and remembered how the numbers felt. He spoke to Cecily for 20 minutes. He spoke to Aunt Marjorie about the proposed settlement, £800 per annum, the terms to be finalized by solicitors. He stood to take his leave. And then, crossing the room toward the door, he paused at Georgiana's corner. She did not look up. She was pulling a length of white thread through dark fabric, and her hands were steady, and she was very aware that her gown was 3 seasons old. "Miss Hartley," he said. She looked up. He was looking at her with the quality of attention she had seen him give the objects in the room, but held longer. The thread in her fingers made a small sound against the fabric. "You are the younger Miss Hartley," he said, as if establishing a fact that had been disputed. "I am, Your Grace." He said nothing further. He inclined his head and left. Aunt Marjorie said he seemed a serious man. Cecily said she thought him very handsome in a forbidding sort of way, and then caught herself and looked at her hands. Georgiana looked at the door through which he had gone and told herself it was nothing. A man noting a presence in a room he had entered. An inventory, no more. She was wrong. She would not know that for some time. She told the listener of this story, if she had told anyone at all, that the weeks following the Duke's first call were weeks in which she watched her sister negotiate the edges of a decision. Cecily smiled in drawing rooms and danced in ballrooms, and came home afterward and sat on the edge of Georgiana's bed, and said nothing for long intervals in which Georgiana could feel something going unsaid. Then Agnes fell ill. It was not the cough, which had remained what it was, but a fever that arrived on a Wednesday night and was serious by Thursday morning. The nearest apothecary was sent for. Aunt Marjorie, who was genuinely not without feeling, spent an anxious 40 minutes consulting with the apothecary, and then retired to her room with a headache. Cecily, who had a morning call at 10:30 that she could not shift without explanation, went. Georgiana stayed. She sat beside Agnes's bed in the small room at the top of the house that smelled of the coal grate and the lavender water that Agnes kept in a brown bottle on her nightstand. Agnes was 20 years old and afraid of being dismissed for being ill, and Georgiana told her she would not be dismissed and brought her soup that was thin but warm, and then, because Agnes was restless and could not sleep and the afternoon was long, read to her. She had brought her father's copy of Johnson's Lives of the Poets, which was probably not what Agnes would have chosen for herself. Agnes bore it with the patience of someone too grateful for company to object. Georgiana read about Milton, and then about Dryden, and then, because Agnes's eyes were finally growing heavy, moved to a passage about friendship and constancy that her father had underlined in pencil sometime in the years before his hands began to shake. She read it slowly. She kept her voice level. She did not hear the footstep on the stair. James had come to Clifford Street to speak with Aunt Marjorie about a particular clause in the settlement terms. He had been shown in by the housemaid and told that Mrs. Marjorie Hartley would return within the quarter hour, and he was waiting in the ground-floor corridor when the sound of the reading reached him from above. He could not have said afterward why he followed it. The stair was narrow, and he took it without announcement, and he stopped in the doorway to the small room at the top of the house, and stood there for a time that was longer than he intended. She was reading in a plain gray dress, her hair dressed without ornament, her face turned toward the page at an angle that showed him her profile, the particular steadiness of it, the quality that was not beauty in the conventional sense, but was something the conventional sense had simply failed to name correctly. The sick girl in the bed was nearly asleep. Georgiana's voice continued without interruption, reading her father's underlined passage about the obligations of constancy to those who cannot claim them by rank or by fortune. James stood in that doorway and understood, in the way that arrives not as a thought, but as the ending of a long argument, what kind of person she was. He went back down the stairs. He waited for Aunt Marjorie. He concluded the point about the clause. He left without mentioning what he had seen, but the fact of it stayed in him the way a coal stays in the grate after the fire appears to have gone out, giving off a heat that takes a full hour to acknowledge. He began, after that, to direct small protections toward her in the ways available to him. When the matter of the Hartley debt arose again at a conversation with his solicitor, he asked whether it would be possible, within the established negotiations, to settle the £4,200 as part of the arrangement rather than leaving it to accrue interest. His solicitor looked at him with the careful expression of a man noting an irregularity and deciding not to name it aloud, and said that it could certainly be structured that way. At Lady Hartcastle's next assembly, when Georgiana was placed at the supper table beside an elderly gentleman who had strong views about the deficiencies of the female mind, and expressed them at length, James crossed the room and spoke to the table's hostess, and Georgiana was quietly moved to a better seat. He could not have explained either action as more than practical. He did not try to explain them, even to himself. Georgiana noticed the moved seat. She attributed it to Lady Hartcastle's goodwill. She had learned, over 21 years, to search for the practical explanation before the sentimental one, because the practical explanation was almost always the correct one for a woman in her position. She was not foolish about this. She was simply accurate. The awareness of him was harder to be accurate about. He was near her, sometimes, in ways that had no obvious social warrant. He stood at the edge of the same conversation without joining it, He looked at her hands once when she was holding a cup of tea at Mrs. Vane's house, with an attention she felt in the cup itself. At the Haverford Music Hall, he sat 2 chairs to her left, and she was conscious for the full duration of the second movement of the precise distance between them, the particular quality of stillness he brought to a room, and the way his breath changed when the cellist reached the slow passage in the center of the piece. She told herself, each time, that she was misreading it. A man of his rank and discipline did not look at women like her in those ways. She was the forgettable sister. She was the one who was simply there. Her wound was very old and very sure of itself, and it was quicker than she was. What she did not know was how little sleep he was getting. He had not thought about Eleanor in a long time, or rather he had thought about her in the way one thinks about a scar, recognizing its location, avoiding direct pressure. Eleanor Ashworth, née Bracewell, had been 24 years old when Clara was born, and 24 years old when she died the following morning. And the word the physician had used was complication, which was a physician's word for a thing that could not be spoken plainly. James had been in London when it happened, managing an estate matter he had decided could not wait, because he had been 29 years old and had not yet understood that there are decisions that cannot be undone. He had ridden 3 days without stopping and arrived at Ashworth to find Clara in the arms of the wet nurse and Eleanor already in the ground. He had turned her portrait to face the wall the following week. He had told himself it was grief. It was grief. It was also something that took him a long time to name, which was that he could not look at the portrait without looking at the date of the decision he had made that kept him in London, and he was not ready to have that conversation with himself. Clara was 6 years old now and had her mother's eyes and her father's reticence, and a governess who was good with children, but who had told James gently that the child seemed to be waiting for something she did not know how to ask for. It was Miss Hargreaves, the governess, who told him this during his last visit to Ashworth in the month before the season began. He had sat with Clara at tea and watched her arrange her small china cups with the precision of a child performing normality, and he had felt a weight that did not have a name settle on him, and he had come to London and opened negotiations with Aunt Marjorie Hartley and told himself that what Clara needed was a household made complete. What he had not told himself was what kind of woman should complete it. If you have stayed with this story long enough to feel the weight of it, you understand already what was coming. Leave a word in the comments if you felt the shift in him at the doorway, and then stay, because it is about to become much worse before it resolves. Lady Dorothea Ashworth arrived from Ashworth Estate in the 2nd week of May. She was 61 years old and had been managing her son's social affairs since the year Eleanor died, with the particular confidence of a woman who has never been wrong about the things she considers important, and who considers a great many things important. She was not cruel. She was certain. Miss Portia Vane, who was 22 and accomplished and whose mother had been Lady Dorothea's closest friend for 30 years, was her candidate for the role that Cecily Hartley currently occupied in the negotiations. She had accepted, with visible patience, the Cicely direction when James had first proposed it. She had not stopped working. She called on Georgiana at Clifford Street in a carriage with the Ashworth crest. She was very polite. She sat in the narrow drawing room in a gown of deep gray that cost more than 3 months of Aunt Marjorie's housekeeping, and she said, in a voice that carried warmth with the same instrument that carried precision, that she understood the Hartley sisters were in a difficult position regarding certain financial arrangements. She said that it seemed to her, as a woman of some experience, that it would be better for all parties if the negotiations proceeded with clarity about their object. She said that the object of the negotiations was a match with the elder Miss Hartley, and that any confusion arising from the younger Miss Hartley's continued presence in the household social circle would be, she feared, damaging to the younger Miss Hartley herself. She set a sealed envelope on the table between them. Georgiana looked at the envelope. She looked at Lady Dorothea. She said, "I have not created any confusion, my lady." "No," Lady Dorothea said. "You have not done so deliberately." The brief pause she left after deliberately was the most precise instrument in the room. Georgiana pushed the envelope back across the table. "I see," Lady Dorothea said. Something moved in her eyes, very quickly, that might have been surprise and might have been the beginning of a recalculation. She took the envelope. She said that she hoped Georgiana understood the social realities of the season for a young woman of limited means and no title, and that she wished her well. She left. Georgiana sat in the empty room for a while. The wallpaper had a pattern of faded climbing roses that she had never liked. She looked at it until she understood what the visit meant. That Lady Dorothea had noticed something, and that the something Lady Dorothea had noticed was not Georgiana's doing, but was nonetheless about to become Georgiana's problem. Cecily came home that evening from a morning call that had run long and sat on the edge of the sofa and looked at the window, and finally said, "Georgiana, I have to tell you something about Francis Carew." Lieutenant Francis Carew had been stationed with the regiment quartered in Hertfordshire for 11 months before the Hartley sisters had come to London. He had ridden out to the Hartley property twice on matters relating to a disputed right-of-way, and he had stayed both times for tea, and Cecily had poured. He was 28 and fair-haired, and had a voice that Georgiana remembered as being very careful with whatever it said, as if the speaker knew the weight of words and chose to carry only as many as he needed. Cecily said she knew it was impossible. She said she knew what the debt was, and what the entail meant, and what the Duke of Ashworth's settlement would provide, and that she was not a foolish girl who did not understand mathematics. She said all of this in the voice of a woman who has rehearsed the reasonable argument so many times that it has worn smooth, and then she stopped and looked at her hands and did not say the rest of it, which was that mathematics was not the difficulty. "You cannot accept him," Georgiana said. "I must." "You cannot," Georgiana said again, more quietly. "Not like this. He would know, Cecily. He is not a man who would not know." The Vane Ball was on the 14th of May. It was Lady Dorothea's preferred arena, and she used it accordingly. James was present and managing the room with his customary discipline, which meant he was everywhere he was needed and visibly at ease in none of it. Miss Portia Vane moved through the evening on her mother's careful stage direction, managing to be beside James at each of the 3 intervals that a skilled social arranger could create at such an event. She was composed and accomplished, and Georgiana, watching from near the doorway of the refreshment room, thought that Portia Vane was performing very well in a scene she had not written and might not have chosen. Lady Dorothea found her there. She did not lower her voice. This was the choice, and it was a deliberate one. And the 2 women standing nearby who happened to hear were not accidents. She said that she had hoped her earlier conversation with Miss Hartley had clarified the situation, and that she was disappointed to find clarification had not been sufficient. She said it with the warmth of a woman conveying concern, and every syllable was a blade. A schemer, she said, was a strong word, and she did not use it lightly. But a young woman of no fortune who had made herself a fixture in a great household's social affairs by means her social betters could only wonder at was making her own bed, and Lady Dorothea wished her to understand that the bed would be cold. The two women nearby drifted away with the expressions of people carrying something fragile. Georgiana said, "Thank you for your counsel, my lady," and turned to look at the refreshment table with an attention she did not have, because the alternative was to let Lady Dorothea see what the words had done. She rode home in the Clifford Street carriage and did not tell Cecily what had been said, because Cecily was already carrying enough. She went to bed and lay awake for a long time looking at the ceiling, which was cracked in a line from the window to the center rosette, and which she had been looking at since April. In the morning, James called at Clifford Street and spoke with Aunt Marjorie for 40 minutes about the terms. Georgiana, passing the drawing-room door on her way to fetch Agnes's midday soup, heard him discussing the schedule for the formal announcement. His voice was even, professional, and gave away nothing at all. She stood in the corridor for a moment with the bowl of soup warm in her hands, and then she went upstairs. This was what the season had always been, she told herself. A woman of her position did not expect to be chosen. She expected to endure. She had known this since before she packed her trunk in March, since before she heard Mrs. Pelham's voice at the window in April, since before every small moment she had allowed herself to misread. The soup was getting cold. She brought it to Agnes. That evening she sat at her father's writing desk. The letter took 3 attempts. The first was too careful, and the second was too honest in ways that served her feelings rather than the situation, and the third was both honest and useful, which is the harder thing to achieve. She wrote that she believed the Duke was a man of enough good sense to wish to know what she was about to tell him before the formal announcement was made. She wrote that her sister Cecily had formed an attachment prior to the season to Lieutenant Francis Carew of the Hertfordshire Regiment, and that the attachment was serious and mutual, and that Cecily had been prepared to set it aside out of duty to her family, but that Georgiana believed this would be a misery to all 3 parties involved in the proposed arrangement, including His Grace. She wrote that she took full responsibility for any inconvenience her letter might cause, and wished him well in whatever direction he chose to take. She did not write anything about herself. There was nothing about herself that was appropriate to put in such a letter. She sealed it and went downstairs and paid the Clifford Street footman a shilling to deliver it to Grosvenor Square before 8 in the morning. Then she went back to bed and lay awake again. And this time the ceiling crack ran from the window all the way to the end of whatever she had allowed herself to expect from this season, and it was a long crack, and she traced it until it was light. James read the letter at his breakfast table. He read it twice. He set it down and looked at the coffee in his cup, which was cooling. He thought about Cecily Hartley, who had smiled in his drawing room 6 times, and whose smile had never once looked quite the way smiles looked when they were unguarded. He thought about Lieutenant Francis Carew, whom he had never met, but whose regiment he knew by name. He thought about his solicitor. He thought about his mother, who was going to require a particular kind of conversation. And then he sat with the letter in front of him and thought about the woman who had written it, who had handed him the solution to her family's difficulty in exchange for nothing at all, who had not asked for anything, who had not placed herself in the letter in any way except as the instrument of someone else's honest welfare, and he understood that this was exactly what she was. He had known it since the doorway on the stair. He had been working around the knowledge for 6 weeks, because he had not trusted himself to name what he wanted since Eleanor, and because what he wanted for himself had ceased to seem like a category he had the right to. He folded the letter and placed it in the inside pocket of his coat, close to where he carried the miniature of Clara that he had had painted the previous autumn, his daughter's face in the small oval frame that he touched without thinking when a room required him to be colder than he felt. The Ashworth dinner that evening had been arranged by Lady Dorothea 3 weeks prior. 14 guests, the Haverford cousins, Sir William Hardcastle, the Pelham couple, the Vanes, Miss Portia Vane. The Hartley party, meaning Aunt Marjorie and both sisters, had been included in the original invitation, and Lady Dorothea had not withdrawn it, because withdrawing it would have required an explanation that created more inconvenience than it solved. She had calculated, Georgiana thought later, that the dinner could be managed. Lady Dorothea was a woman who believed firmly in her ability to manage a room. She had not calculated the letter. Georgiana arrived at the Ashworth house on Grosvenor Square in her best dress, which was navy silk retrimmed at the collar with a white lace she had unpicked from a gown of her mother's and resewn that afternoon. She had been very careful with her hair. She had taken these small precautions not because she expected anything from the evening, but because she had decided, at some point between the letter and the carriage, that she was going to face whatever came with a surface that did not apologize for itself. The dress was plain. It was clean and well-fitted, and she had sewn the collar herself, and it was as good as she could make it. The dinner proceeded for 2 hours. James sat at the head of the table and managed it with the tension that cost him something, the same tension she had seen at the first call in April, and she watched him and wondered if he had read her letter and decided she had been impertinent. She wondered if he had arranged for Cecily and Aunt Marjorie to be told at some other hour, in some other room. She kept her hands flat on the table and ate what was served and answered Sir William Hardcastle's questions about the Hertfordshire countryside with the accuracy they deserved. Lady Dorothea's moment came between the fish course and the meat. She did not shout. Shouting was beneath her, and always had been. She said to Mrs. Pelham, in the carrying voice she had used at the Vane ball, that it was a shame when the innocence of a formal gathering was complicated by the presence of those who had not, whatever their other qualities, the good breeding to understand the limits of their position. She said a schemer was a word she had used in private, but would not shrink from in company, since the company assembled were people whose judgment she trusted, and whose awareness of these matters served everyone. She looked once at Georgiana, without warmth or malice, simply with the certainty of a woman delivering a verdict she has held for some time. The table went quiet, in the way dinner tables go quiet when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Aunt Marjorie made a small sound. Cecily's hand found Georgiana's under the edge of the tablecloth and pressed it. Georgiana looked at the candelabra at the center of the table, which held 12 candles, and focused on the particular quality of its light. Miss Portia Vane, seated at Lady Dorothea's right hand, looked at Georgiana and then at the Duke, and understood, in a single brief, unwelcome flash, exactly how this dinner was going to end. James stood. He did not look at his mother. He looked across the table at Georgiana, and the quality of attention he brought to it was the same quality she had first felt in the back sitting room in April, the quality that did not look at a woman and see what the room had decided she was. He looked at her and saw what was there. The 14 guests at the table registered it in the way bodies register the change of weather before the mind catches up. He walked the length of the table. He stopped beside her chair and held out his hand. The room was entirely silent. Outside in Grosvenor Square, a carriage passed with the sound of hooves on stone, and then there was only the candles. "Miss Georgiana," he said, which was her given name, and which he had never used before. He had chosen it as a marked event, the way one chooses the precise word in a sentence that cannot be amended. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. The thing she saw there was not performance. It was a man who had made a decision in the only arena where it would mean what he needed it to mean. She placed her hand in his. He held it. He addressed the table, and his voice was level and carried no apology, and required none. "I intend," he said, "to direct my attentions, as I should have directed them a considerable time ago, and toward the person who has demonstrated, in every particular, the qualities I most wish to have at Ashworth." Lady Dorothea's fan was open in her hand. Something crossed her face, very quickly. That was not quite what she would have called humility, but was the nearest thing to it she had reached in some years. It was recognition. She had been wrong, and she was not a stupid woman, and she knew it. And the knowing showed. Portia Vane looked at her lap with the expression of a woman who is relieved, actually, despite everything, and will require some time alone to understand why. Aunt Marjorie said, "Oh," in a voice that contained an entire season of worry resolving at once. Cecily, for the first time all evening, smiled with both halves of her face. The journey from London to Ashworth took 3 days by post-chaise, and Georgiana made it in the first week of November, after a quiet ceremony in the chapel at Clifford Street that contained 12 people and no speeches, and a great deal of gray November light coming through the old windows. Cecily had come, and so had Lieutenant Carew, whom Georgiana met properly for the first time on the morning of the ceremony, and whom she found to be exactly what his voice had suggested. A man very careful with what he carried. He and Cecily were to be married at Christmas in Hertfordshire, at the church where their father was buried, and the Hartley debt was settled, and the cousin Oswald had been made aware of the arrangement and had expressed, in a letter that managed to be simultaneously gracious and aggrieved, his understanding of the situation. Ashworth in November was vast and quiet, and gray-stoned under a sky the color of an old coin. The governess, Miss Hargreaves, met them at the door, with Clara at her side. Clara was 6 years old, and had her mother's eyes, dark and watchful. And she stood very straight in her pinafore, and looked at Georgiana with the expression of a child who has been hoping for something for a long time, and has learned not to say so. James put his hand briefly on his daughter's shoulder, and Clara looked up at him and then back at Georgiana, and said in a voice so careful it hurt to hear, "Are you going to stay?" "Yes," Georgiana said. "I am going to stay." That evening James took her through the long corridor on the east wing and showed her the rooms one by one, naming what each had held and what he thought it could hold now. And when they reached the small study that had been Eleanor's, she saw the portrait on the wall, no longer turned to face the plaster. Eleanor Ashworth looked out from the canvas with a composed young face and dark eyes that Clara had inherited, and James stood beside the portrait for a moment, in the way that people stand beside the things they have been avoiding for a long time, when they have finally decided the avoidance cost more than the looking. "She would have liked you," he said. It was not a long sentence, and it was not a speech, and it was the truest thing he had said to her in 6 months of near true things. The first snow came in the final week of November, quietly, the way first snows come in Hertfordshire, without announcement. Georgiana was in the library with a fire built up against the cold and a book of Johnson's that was not her father's copy, but was the same edition, purchased from a bookseller in the nearby market town. Clara had appeared at the library door an hour ago and been invited in and had not left. She was asleep now in the chair beside the hearth, her dark hair loose against the cushion, her small hand curled in the way children's hands curl in sleep, as if holding something they cannot quite put down. James came in from his study with the miniature in his hand, the small oval painting of Clara that he carried in his coat pocket in every room of every house he had entered for the past year. And he looked at his sleeping daughter and set the miniature on the mantelpiece beside the clock, where it could stay. He stood behind Georgiana's chair and looked out the window at the snow coming down in the last light, and she felt his hand rest on her shoulder with the weight of something that had been waiting a long time to be set down. Outside, the snow fell on the stone walls, and the bare garden and the road that ran from London to Ashworth. 3 days of winter distance between the life that had seemed like all there was, and the house that was, now, hers. The fire crackled. Clara slept. The snow covered everything, quietly and without argument, the way Grace covers what it covers. If this story settled something in you, leave a word in the comments, whatever moved you most. There are more stories here, told the same way, about women who expected to endure and were offered instead the thing they had stopped asking for.